Hello viewers and welcome to Rwanda Television. I'm Emmanuel Munyarukumbuzi and we are having a special interview with very blessed to have with us Professor Ibrahim Gambari, who is also sitting at the Advisory Council of ISCA, or the International Security Conference on Africa. We're very happy to have you here today.
It's my pleasure to be here and to be in Rwanda for so many other occasions, including starting from 1995.
Oh,
Maybe
that's
some
wonderful.
of our viewers may not have been born by that time.
Exactly.
I'm not being specific.
So you wear many hats, and we can't say everything that you've done for Africa, everything you've done for Nigeria, your home country, but I can mention that you were a chief of staff to the president in Nigeria, that you also served as a special or permanent representative of Nigeria to the United Nations, and many other functions that you had that we cannot enumerate in the course of this interview. Now, to start off, to kick off our conversation, in light of your extensive experience on security matters in Africa and beyond Africa, what strategies do you think ISCA should prioritize in order to stand out as an effective body or an NGO and not a redundant platform in addressing today's security challenges?
Two important issues. First is to look at security as humans, about human security, because people tend to look at security as physical security. That's important, but you can have a country physically secure, but the people are insecure. So it's about the security of the human being with so many dimensions: economic security, political security, environmental security. So the impact of all of that on the human being is important. The second is that, again, we have to look at security not as separate from development, not separate from democratization and good governance. Because, again, you may have peace, but you cannot sustain peace without development. And you will not have a sustainable development without political stability. So peace, security, development, good governance should be linked and not regarded in isolation. So that linkage between peace, security, on the one hand, development, and good governance is important. And secondly, ultimately, is about the security of the human beings within communities, within countries, within regions, within continent, and ultimately a global dimension of security.
Now, as I said earlier in my introduction, you have served in many instances at national level and international level and at the United Nations level. When you look at a conference like ISCA, or the International Security Conference on Africa, you realize that's a lot of competence, and you realize that there's a lot of goodwill to do well as a continent. When you think about the history, you remember the big names, the Kwame Nkrumahs, the fathers of independence. You think about Nasser in the north, you think about Samora Machel in the south, and all those big names in every single African country. So, which means the dream is also there. What do you think is lacking today that we still hear in different corners of the continent, that human security is not present?
Yeah, precisely. Now, you mentioned big names. In many ways, there were actors in a situation. And the situation in which they were there and made their greatest impact was on securing independence for their respective nations, fighting the colonialism on the continent, fighting apartheid on our continent. And they did a pretty good job of it. One of them, Nkrumah, even believed that, and I quote, "Seek ye the kingdom, the political kingdom, and all else will follow." Well, all else did not follow, because political independence did not actually mean economic independence. It did not mean control over resources. It did not mean getting fair prices for what we produce in Africa.
Are we talking about a simplistic view?
Yes, so it's simplistic. And he faced the ultimate price of being removed from power. Somebody who was hugely popular within his country and outside. Then secondly, the idea that we cannot go it alone was also a fairly late recognition. So because if you recall, or some of our viewers recall, we didn't have the Organization of African Unity until the middle of the 1960s, which was the decade of independence. Then we realized that the OAU, as you don't know, was almost just an alliance of leaders. It didn't sufficiently address the totality of the interests of the peoples of the continent. And that organization was not enough. And the next generation of leaders then thought of the next step, which is to move from the Organization of African Unity, we emphasize security, sovereignty, independence, to much more economic integration, and linking economic development with political independence. And by which time, by the way, almost all African countries had become independent. Apartheid was ended, and then they moved towards African Union, where you surrender some sovereignty in order to promote the greater good of the people, both in terms of political security, political independence with economic integration. And then we're now realizing that by this decade, that again, political independence was not enough, economic cooperation was not enough. We have to have good governance, the way in which we are governed, because the absence of good governance, the low performance of the economy, the fact that the dividends, even of democracy and independence, were not clear, now left them to begin to think of what is the missing component, and ultimately it's about good governance, where the dividends of democracy will be felt by the ordinary people, where the people will be secured politically, economically, and even in terms of environmental security. So you have various phases of interest and response to the challenges over the decades. But what is constant is the recognition now that no country in Africa, no country in the world, but let alone in Africa, can go it alone, can succeed alone in meeting the demands and the needs of their people in this broad definition of human security and the linkage between peace and security, between economic development and good governance.
Wonderful. Now you're talking about the importance of looking at it from a holistic perspective. You talked about economic independence, you talked about political independence and economic empowerment and good governance as components of the Africa we want. Now we have ISCA today. Is it going to solve all those problems at the same time? And I'm asking this in an environment where we already have other mechanisms, whether political coalitions, whether economic bodies, regional economic bodies, where we have national security mechanism, international security mechanism, which are attached to political mechanism. How does ISCA come into that family of mechanisms, coalitions, and organizations?
I will respond to this in two ways. First is to look at comparative models of dealing with international security before ISCA. And those models were essentially the Munich Security Conference, as an example.
Yes.
And it turned out that this Munich Security Conference, the premise was that Europe was the center of the world. And the challenges of Europe should become challenges of the world. Just like we talk of World War I, World War II, they were essentially European wars that dragged the rest of the world into them. In fact, Africans were fighting on one side or the other in what was essentially a European war. But that aside, that Munich Security Conference was also more about transatlantic alliance and relationship. That's the link between Europe and North America. Hardly do they discuss African security issues. And when they do, very marginal. So ISCA's difference, number one, would be this is an international security conference on Africa, in Africa, largely by Africans, largely for Africans. Of course, we recognize that Africa is part of the world. That's why it's called international. We could have said security conference on Africa. It's international. So that's a recognition, but ultimately it's about ownership. You know, a security conference analyzing African security challenges, profiling solutions that are practicable, implementing those proposals, but from the African perspective, from the Africa's ownership of this, because we live in this world. Others have interests here, but they don't live here. So that's one difference. The second is that we have several mechanisms, like African peer review mechanism, which I was privileged to be chairman of the panel of experts, eminent persons. We have African governance architecture, we have several protocols, but something was lacking, that there's no study of lessons learned. Why have they succeeded? To what extent have they succeeded? Where are they failing? And that interconnectedness is what I sincerely hope, and I believe from what I've seen so far, that ISCA will going to be different, to pull together the various strands of governance issues as part of security and broadening the concept of security to include all these aspects that I've mentioned earlier. And something that is sustainable and predictable. For example, ISCA will be every year. So we know that we'll come together, evaluate what has been done the year before and what is going to happen the following year. And we will know in advance when the next conference will be. But in between the conference, studies will be commissioned. That's where the role of the advisory council will be important, because the conference board will be about the management of the secretariat and the program and objectives, but then you have the advisory council, of which again I'm privileged to be a member, of people who have combined theory with practice. On security. They have internalized lessons learned, and they can then advise on what works, what doesn't work, and whether or not we are going the right direction or not. So we're all very excited and have a very good start. There's a proverb in Nigeria that if your Sunday, just to use that, it's going to be very pleasant and rewarding, is from Wednesdays or even Monday or Tuesday that will see the signs. So the signs are good. For example, only yesterday, there was a joint meeting of the Advisory Council and the Conference Board and the Secretariats, because again, the idea is that we have to all work together. We have various competencies, but we have to work together as a team in moving the agenda of fiscal forward, because it's a bold vision. It's never happened before, and we have to make it work. And in my view, based from experience, one of the ways in which we can succeed is where the international mechanisms, to throw light on why some international mechanism for peace and security in our continent in the international dimension of it have not worked. There are three areas. First, peacekeeping in Africa, international peacekeeping has not worked. Illustration, you've had Mali in Central African Republic, they're asking the UN peacekeeping mission to leave.
Why do you think it hasn't worked?
Because it has not addressed the basic needs of the people for security. It has not addressed the root causes of conflict. It has not addressed, and this is the second point, which our biggest need is prevention. You know, because peacekeeping is about curing. It's about separating combatants and making peace between warring factions. So then the international community tried in Darfur, UNAMI, United Nations African Mission in Darfur, where for the first time in the history of this continent, there was a peacekeeping mission, international peace, mandated by two organizations, the UN and the African Union. But again, in the end, it did not work. So we have to think of things that haven't been done before, or things that have been done poorly, and see how we can make a difference. Secondly, prevention has not been a focus. Whereas imagine how much we will save in lives, how much we will save in properties and costs if we have to prevent conflicts rather than to try to palliative, which is what peacekeeping is about. The third, in my view, area which the international community have fared poorly, mediation. Let me give you an example. I was privileged to be the first non-Western head of the Department of Political Affairs of the United Nations. Before, this position was supposed to be reserved for the big boys, the permanent members of Security Council citizens. But I was the first non-Western country person to be heading it. And after me, incidentally, my three successors in this post have all been, in fact, not only Western, but American. So anyway, with this perspective, I will, of course, under the leadership of the then Secretary General, to establish a mediation support unit. You know how much money we had for the mediation support for the whole world? $400 million. Whereas for peacekeeping, in Darfur alone, at the height of the operation, the UN was spending close to $2 billion a year.
Just one mission.
One mission. And
As
at that
opposed
time,
to a world
for mediation. That's very tragic that the world was willing to spend a lot of money on peacekeeping, but not on prevention or on mediation. To bring conflicts that could not be prevented, at least to bring it to an end.
And what's your analysis of that prioritization?
Precisely. Now, I said the easy thing is to respond after the fact. The more difficult thing is to prevent bad things from happening, which means you have to have knowledge of the situation, knowledge about the combatant, address the root causes of the conflicts, and then also mediation. We train people who have the knowledge of the history, who are trusted, to bring conflict to an end. And we're seeing it globally. Right now, as we speak, look at Ukraine, Russian intervention in Ukraine, Sudan falling apart, South Sudan, in the world's youngest nation, in crisis. Not to mention, of course, Eastern Congo. All of this, where are the mediators to try to bring water? And then I want to also remind our viewers and people, the United Nations was set up to prevent wars. It's, in the preamble to the UN Charter, it says, to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in the lifetime of the founding fathers brought untold sorrows to mankind. I'm quoting. So it's to be a prevention of wars. That's been abandoned. Peacekeeping is failing. So we have to now see what works or what could work, which is prevention, mediation, and addressing root causes of conflict. And that's where I believe the International ISCA, International Security Conference in Africa, could make a difference. We don't want to be just a copy of Munich Security Conference. The challenges facing us in many ways are also different in several aspects from the challenges facing the Europeans or concerning the relationship between the Europeans and the Americans.
I'll come back to the word international and the word African. Some of the biggest criticisms were that Africa lacks a unified voice, that there's fragmentation in so many ways in the human experience, as you put it rightly. Do you think ISCA is going to change the dynamic in any way? Or is it going to be one of those great initiatives whose results are going to be delayed or be waited for?
Yeah, you're right. Recent experience could point in the direction that maybe this is another experiment that will not work. But I think because, in a sense, that is here in Rwanda, and the initiative by the President Kagame, who has lived through himself the challenge of the tragedies of conflict, the tragedies of genocide, but also the process of rebuilding, peace building, peace consolidation, from experience of somebody who has lived through it. I was privileged to come to this country in 1995 for the first time, year after the genocide. The country was broken, the spirit of the people was broken. I came back in 2005. I was then heading a United Nations Security Council mission to Rwanda.
10 years later.
Yeah. And then I came back 10 years later. The transformation, and then we're talking about 2025. I mean, a broken country, a broken people. Now, how that has changed.
Some have even said a failed state.
Yeah, yes. Now, look at it now. Rwanda is hosting the International Security Conference on Africa, is hosting African School of Governance. Okay. In other words, bringing to play what did not exist before, which is a country and people with a vision of peace building, and never again to return to the tragedy of the past. So that's what gives me confidence. However, having said that, the International Security Conference in Africa is not a Rwanda Security Conference. It's the African Security Conference on Security Conference on Africa with an international dimension, because we don't live in Africa. We have the most resources in the world, and our continent contains the poorest people. There's a dichotomy. There's what's happening. So we have to change the terms of trade, the terms of interaction between us and those who are benefiting from the current situation, whereby they take our resources and we get poverty in return.
So are we saying that, you've said that very eloquently, but for our viewers,
Yeah.
sometimes it's good to reiterate certain
Sure,
things.
sure.
Are you saying ISCA is going to fill that void of lack of unified voice towards the promotion of a positive human experience?
Absolutely, and it cannot be done by any one country. We have to do it together. And I don't buy these ideas that the Africans, they cannot speak with one voice. Of course, we have spoken with one voice to end colonialism in Africa, and we have succeeded. There's only one colony left in the whole of Africa, Western Sahara. That's another issue. We've ended apartheid, spoken with one voice. We've said there has to be mechanisms to promote African unity. It has happened. So, the idea
Maybe
we don't
before
speak...
we really develop that point,
Yeah.
because I think we're going to end with that point of, Afro optimism.
Precisely.
But before then, I'd like you to explain a little bit the role of women in peacekeeping, role of women in improving that human security experience, as you rightly put it.
Yeah.
What do you think is the role they play or they should play?
Well, I was privileged to be head of the UN African Union mission in Darfur. Now, we had 17 IDP camps. People were displaced. They were running away. Why? The most difficult people in the world are internally displaced persons. Because if you have refugees, there are laws and institutions guiding how the host country will treat them. There are no laws and conventions on how to treat internally because they are running away from home, from government. So why are they running away? It's no security, no provision of social services, health and education, and no means of livelihood. No livelihood. So what I'm saying is, now, when you have countries experiencing war and conflict, who suffers the most? The women and the children. So we have to involve the women in international peacekeeping operations and peace building, how to put back. You can't put back a society together if you don't put families back together. And who is central to that is women. Two, the women are the most enterprising when it comes to management of resources. I'm very proud of two things. As a Nigerian, the women in Nigeria, now you go into banking, most of the managing directors, CEOs of banks, in the big banks in Nigeria are women, not by accident. We have not done as well in terms of empowering women politically because right now we have not managed to elect not even a single governor in any one of the 36 states of Nigeria, let alone thinking of president or vice president. So there are a long way to go there. But the recognition that you cannot deal with peace building, you cannot deal with war prevention, you cannot deal with mediation successfully without involving the women. And we have an experience in West Africa, the so-called Mano River Union Women's Association, that they literally brought a war to end in Liberia and in Sierra Leone because of they stood up and said, enough is enough. Who suffers the most when there's crisis and wars? It's we. And therefore we demand that this conflict ends.
Indeed. We can see that there's a lot women can do if given a voice, as you said, and also they have also demonstrated a lot of capacity that has been recognized in other various sectors. Why not in security? What about young people? Because we talk about young people sometimes with in a very bad light, irresponsible, immature, and things like that. How can we, or how does ISCA, or an initiative similar to ISCA's, bring young people on board and ensure we improve the human experience?
We must improve the way we have the leadership selection process. We have to involve the youth a lot more, interest them in their political education. That if they don't get involved, the countries will still be run by older people. And so the way we run our political parties, the way in which we encourage promotion from in the public service and stress skills And who are the people that are the most up to date in terms of ICTs,
Yeah,
computers? We are talking about artificial intelligence. I mean, these are areas that are ripe for revolution, and only the youth can lead it. And also, if they are not too young to vote, why are they too young to lead? And so we mustn't look at the youth as the leaders of tomorrow. They are leaders now, and we have to encourage them, mentor them, and the mentoring mechanism also has to be improved. When I was growing up, we were mentored. They looked at the bright students, they encouraged them, mentored them, advised them, but somehow the system broke down.
And we're not seeing any
we're not seeing that. No. Absolutely, mentoring,
discussions.
Or it's only again one bright spot. We are ending on a positive note. Is the Elumelu is a Nigerian billionaire, and has a program for African entrepreneurs and trains hundreds from different parts of Africa right now to begin to recognize their skills, hone their skills, mentor them to assume leadership from now. Because I'm a political scientist by training. Power is nobody gives you power. You have to go and take it. So they have to organize, but they have to be mentored in order to be able to do so. And above all, one advantage Africa has over all other continents, we're a young continent. The median age for Nigerian youth, for example, is 17. I'm 80 years old, So we are 0.0 something percent marginal, really. So, and yet, many of us are still around. Some, thank God for that. But, that's the median age. Whereas other continents are aging. They are aging. Our population is young. And the future belongs to the young.
So now I want us to come back to that Afro optimism. Africa came together. I interrupted you when you started talking about Africa coming together to end colonialism, to end apartheid in South Africa. So if you could maybe elaborate on that for the young people, for the citizens and our viewers who are watching today from their homes, what's possible?
But what made it possible? Leadership, you see, in the continent, as we speak, if you look at the major changes that we've mentioned, successes, you had a coalition of the willing, a few of them who led, Now, even the transformation into the African Union, you had Gaddafi, you had Bouteflika in Nigeria, you had Thabo Mbeki of South Africa, the leader in Ethiopia, Wade of Senegal, and even Mubarak in Egypt. They form the core to lead. Because institutions such as the Organization of African Unity or the African Union, they are big, become cumbersome, but you're lacking leadership to ignite and to move the process forward. So that has to happen. And we can also leave everything to Rwanda. This project cannot succeed and say leave it to Rwanda. No. It is our collective responsibility, and then we have to promote, this leadership that seems to be missing in being the catalyst for change, being the voice of Africa, the voice for cooperation, for integration, is very much lacking. And they too will not succeed without involving the women and the youth in this African project of transformation. From looking at security as physical security, but looking at security as human security.
I wanted to summarize to wind up the interview, but I think you've just did a wonderful job by bringing together everything we discussed earlier. So if anything, anybody watching, your last sentences would be able to understand everything. Maybe before we wind up, what are the next steps? You've talked about the discussions you had with as the board, as the advisory council and secretariat. Are there any tangible actions we can be looking forward to? What can a normal citizen like me or the people watching from home, how can they contribute to such a wonderful and great endeavor?
First of all, for having certainty that the next conference will be next year, this date, so that everybody knows in advance, and then that we will be able to evaluate what we've done the year before for the next conference. What are the more pressing challenges? We're talking about women role, the youth role, the taking ownership of our resources, the taking ownership of the even definition of what the challenges are, and what are the proposals that will work. All of this will have to come pretty soon. We won't wait for another 1 year. We have to do that. And that's why the role of the advisory council is critical, because they have people who have experience, people who have been around, and then they can commission studies, they can commission put ideas, new ideas or new ways of looking at old problems. This program, for example, it provides an idea of looking at security from a different perspective, not just physical security, and that the absolute link between peace and security on the one hand, development, and also governance issues in an integrated, comprehensive manner.
Thank you so very much for taking the time to share with our viewers your words of wisdom. And I think it's packed. There's everything in there. We started from the history. We started talking about the different stages of human experience. We started with political independence. We talked about economic cooperation and management. We talked about leadership. Now we're talking about the involvement of young people, involvement of women. We're talking about technology. The young people can use the technology better than the older generation. That's the assumption, but not always. Some older people are also very good at that. We're talking about the future of this conference as a unifying force that will bring that extra mile that had not been around for some time.
And just 1 second, we have to involve the African diaspora.
Oh, and the African diaspora as well.
You know, take again Nigeria that I'm most familiar with. The remittances for the Nigerian in the diaspora in the US alone is about between 12 billion to 20 billion a year. This was something we neglected. Whereas we talk about the totality of aid to Nigeria, less, much less. So the African have a role to play. They are assuming important positions where they are. Mayors, some state legislators, you know, in the executives, in the judiciaries of this country, in the professions, particularly the medical. No, these are people who could make a contribution. They don't all have to come back home, but from where they are, and they can be sources of support and inspiration, particularly in the areas of women empowerment and the youth and science and technology.
Thank you very much for your words of wisdom.
Thank you.
Now, viewers, we come to the end of this special interview. I hope you learned as much as I did learn, and we look forward to the next ISCA conference next year, or the International Security Conference on Africa. Please do enjoy the rest of the programs. I was Emmanuel Munyarukumbuzi bidding you a very, very good day. Bye-bye.